Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you and I are going to unpack a really significant shift, the rise of remote work. We've got some fascinating material here, excerpts from a recent podcast episode that tackles this head-on. Our mission, to get beyond the surface and understand if this move to working from anywhere is truly the new normal or, maybe just a temporary blip.
Yeah, and what immediately jumps out from this podcast source is the central debate. Is remote work the future knocking at the door, or will the allure of the traditional office eventually pull us all back?
Right.
Especially as the immediate pressures of the pandemic ease, it sets up a really interesting tension to explore.
Okay, so the podcast kicks off by reminding us that, well, before 2020, remote work wasn't really mainstream, was it?
No, not at all.
It was more the domain of freelancers and maybe some tech companies, but certainly not the standard for most of us.
That's exactly right. The source emphasizes that it was largely considered an outlier. Then, almost overnight, the pandemic forced this massive, unplanned experiment in remote work.
Yeah.
It wasn't a gradual shift. Companies had to adapt almost instantly. It was, chaotic for many.
And this is where it gets intriguing, right? The podcast highlights how surprised many businesses were by the effectiveness of this forced experiment. There was this initial realization that maybe you get some expectations people could actually get things done outside the traditional office setting.
And the early returns seemed promising. The podcast points to initial reports of increased employee productivity, a welcome decrease in the daily grind of commuting.
Oh, no, definitely.
And a perceived improvement in that elusive work-life balance for many. These early positives really fueled the momentum behind remote work,
Plus, the financial implications for companies were, hard to ignore. The source touches on the considerable cost savings from needing less office space, fewer desks, lower overhead. That's a pretty significant factor, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And that makes you wonder about the long-term impact on, say, commercial real estate.
It certainly does. And it brings up a crucial point for you, the listener, to consider. When we see these reports of increased productivity from home, is that a consistent long-term trend? Or could it have been influenced by the unique circumstances of the pandemic? Perhaps a temporary surge in effort during a crisis. It's a layer worth peeling back, I think.
So digging deeper into why remote work gains such traction, the podcast really emphasizes the power of flexibility. Being able to set your own schedule, that, the source suggests, is a major benefit for a lot of different people. Think about parents juggling family responsibilities, freelancers managing varied workloads, even those of us who find we're just more focused at different times of the day.
And it's fascinating how this flexibility might connect with that productivity statistic. The podcast mentions studies suggesting remote workers can be around 13% more productive.
13%.
Yeah. They attribute this in part to fewer interruptions, those casual coworker drop-ins, the impromptu meetings that can really break your concentration, allowing for more focused, uninterrupted work periods. Makes sense, right?
It does. And from a business perspective, the podcast raises a great point about talent. Remote work really broadens the hiring landscape, doesn't it?
Completely.
Companies aren't limited to candidates within a commutable radius anymore. They can tap into skills and expertise from pretty much anywhere in the world.
And if we consider the bigger picture, this access to a global talent pool could lead to more diverse teams and potentially spark greater innovation. Companies can really seek out the best fit for a role, regardless of where that person happens to live.
And the personal financial benefits for employees shouldn't be overlooked either. The podcast throws out some interesting estimates, suggesting potential annual savings of up to, $6,000?
Yeah, up to $6,000, they said.
For remote workers, on things like commuting costs, lunches out, maybe even the need for a formal work wardrobe. That's a tangible difference for a lot of people.
Absolutely. But as the podcast astutely points out, we need to look at the other side of the coin as well. It's not universally positive.
Exactly. The podcast then explores some of the downsides, and one of the first that comes up is the feeling of, isolation.
Right.
For many, that daily in-person interaction with colleagues provides a crucial sense of connection, and remote work can lead to feelings of being disconnected.
This is a really critical point. While our virtual communication tools have advanced significantly, they still can't fully replicate the nuances and spontaneity of face-to-face interactions.
Sure.
The podcast highlights how those casual conversations in the break room or those spur-of-the-moment brainstorming sessions can be incredibly valuable for team cohesion and, the generation of new ideas. You just don't get that as easily over Zoom.
And the podcast also touches on potential challenges for career growth in remote settings. There's still a perception in some management circles that old out of sight, out of mind idea, where remote employees might not be top of mind for promotions, mentorship opportunities, and those informal networking moments that can be so important for career advancement. It's a real worry for some.
This brings up an important question about fairness and equal opportunity, really. Companies really need to be conscious of this and actively work to ensure that remote team members have the same access to growth and development as their colleagues in the office.
Yeah.
It might require rethinking performance evaluations and mentorship programs, making things more intentional.
The podcast also reminds us that not everyone has an ideal home environment for effective remote work. You might be dealing with distractions, a lack of dedicated workspace, or just the difficulty of separating your professional and personal lives when they're happening in the same physical space.
Oh, these are very real and often underestimated challenges. What works well for one person's living situation might be far from ideal for another's. And it's important to remember that not everyone thrives in a remote work context.
And let's be honest, the podcast doesn't shy away from the distractions. When your office is also your living room, the temptation of streaming services or social media can become a genuine hurdle for maintaining focus.
It definitely demands a different level of self-discipline and time management. The more structured environment of an office can provide an inherent framework that, it can be missing when you're working remotely.
Finally, the podcast raises an interesting point by mentioning some major companies, Google, Apple, Amazon, and their moves to bring employees back to the office, at least some of the time.
Right.
It does make you wonder, could this signal a potential shift away from the remote work trend? Or maybe a correction?
It's certainly a significant development to watch. These decisions by influential companies suggest that there's still a strong underlying belief in the benefits of in-person collaboration and a shared physical workspace. However, it's worth considering that the specific reasons behind these decisions might vary from company to company and could involve factors beyond just productivity, like company culture or innovation worries.
So looking ahead, what picture of the future of work does the podcast paint? Are we heading back to the office en masse, or is remote work going to remain a dominant force? What's the feeling?
Based on the information presented in the source, a hybrid model seems to be emerging as the most likely scenario for many. The idea of a blend working remotely and spending some days in a physical office appears to offer a compromise.
A middle ground.
Exactly, something that addresses the needs and preferences of both employees and employers.
The podcast even cites a McKinsey report indicating that a significant 58% of employees actually prefer this hybrid arrangement. That's a pretty compelling statistic suggesting a strong preference for flexibility, isn't it?
It is. It suggests that many value the autonomy and flexibility that remote work offers, but they also recognize the importance of in-person connections for collaboration and team building. So hybrid models aim to strike that balance.
And technology, the podcast points out, is playing a crucial role in enabling this hybrid future. We're seeing advancements in collaboration platforms, virtual reality meeting technologies, even AI tools to help manage projects across distributed teams.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff.
All designed to bridge the gaps created by distance.
Exactly. Technology is continuously evolving to facilitate more seamless and effective remote and hybrid work experiences. However, the podcast also rightly reminds us that remote work isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
Definitely not.
There are certain sectors like healthcare, hospitality, and manufacturing where a physical presence is, fundamentally required.
Absolutely. You can't really provide hands-on care or run a factory floor remotely in most cases. So, while remote and hybrid models seem set to be significant for many industries, the podcast makes it clear they won't entirely replace traditional work environments across all sectors.
Ultimately, what's really interesting is that this is still a very dynamic situation. Companies are still experimenting, employees are still expressing their preferences, and technology continues to evolve. The future of work isn't some static endpoint. It's an ongoing evolution.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive for you, the listener, our exploration of this podcast material reveals some really significant advantages to remote work, the flexibility, potential cost savings, access to a wider talent pool. However, we also need to acknowledge the genuine challenges around isolation and potential impacts on career growth. And while some might hope for a full return to the traditional office, it appears that hybrid work is shaping up to be the prevailing compromise for a significant portion of the workforce.
Yes, it's about finding that equilibrium, that balance that maximizes the upsides of both remote and in-office work while minimizing the potential downsides. That seems to be the goal for many right now.
So here's a final thought for you to consider long after this deep dive. As this world of work continues to change, how do you see your own needs and preferences fitting into these different models? What kind of work environment do you personally believe would allow you to thrive and be most fulfilled, both professionally and personally, in the years ahead?
Yeah.
It's definitely something worth pondering.